I didn't expect the room to feel so ordinary, a long table, neutral walls, a faint smell of paper and polish. It could have been any administrative office, if not for the fact that my father's absence sat in the chair at the head like something no one wanted to name. I took a seat near the end, not out of politeness, just habit. For years, that's where I had been placed in most things involving him. Close enough to be included, far enough to not matter. My stepmother arrived last. She didn't rush. She never did. There was a kind of quiet certainty in how she moved, like everything had already been decided somewhere else, and we were just here to acknowledge it. She gave me a brief look, not unkind, not warm, just a recognition of position. Then she sat. The lawyer introduced himself, shuffled papers, explained the process in a tone that suggested he had done this many times. His voice stayed even, careful not to lean into anyone's grief too much. I listened, but not closely. I already knew how this would go. It had been years of small adjustments. Conversations I wasn't part of. Decisions that arrived finished. My father had never been confrontational, and over time that had meant others spoke for him, mostly her. So when she leaned forward slightly and spoke before the lawyer could continue, it didn't feel surprising. I think we can be clear, she said, almost gently. There's no provision here for him. She didn't look at me directly this time. She didn't need to. The room shifted in small ways, someone adjusting in their chair. A breath held a little too long. No one challenged her. Why would they? She sounded certain, and certainty often passes for truth in rooms like that. I felt something settle inside me. Not shock, not even anger. Recognition. The lawyer paused just briefly, then continued. He opened the first document, reading through its clauses with professional detachment. Names, percentages, distributions. When he reached my name, he didn't linger. There wasn't anything to linger on. It was clean, final, structured in a way that made it difficult to argue with. I nodded once, mostly to myself. Across the table, my stepmother exhaled softly, as if something administrative had been completed. Not relief exactly, more like confirmation. This was what she had expected. And for a moment the room aligned with her expectation. I could have said something then, asked questions, challenged the process. But I didn't, because the truth was I had already done that work privately weeks ago when things had started to feel too neat, too arranged. When I had noticed the gaps between what was said and what was documented, I had chosen not to confront it then. I wasn't going to start now. The lawyer closed the first folder, placing it carefully to one side. There was a pause, not long, but distinct enough to feel like something unfinished. Then he reached for another envelope. It hadn't been on top of the stack. It hadn't even been visible until that moment. My stepmother's posture changed slightly. Not dramatically, just a small tightening in her shoulders, like a thread had been pulled somewhere she hadn't noticed before. I wasn't aware there was anything else, she said, her voice still controlled. The lawyer didn't respond immediately. He adjusted his glasses, opened the envelope, and scanned the contents. And then, unexpectedly, he let out a quiet laugh. Not loud, not inappropriate, but unmistakable. It didn't belong in that room. Everyone looked at him. I apologize, he said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely sorry. This clarifies things. He placed the document on the table, smoothing it out with deliberate care. This is a later edition, he continued, signed and witnessed separately. It outlined specific allocations not referenced in the primary document. My stepmother leaned forward now, the certainty in her movements replaced by something more focused. What allocations? She asked. The lawyer glanced at her, then at me, before continuing. A trust, he said. Established prior to the final will's drafting, it appears to have been structured independently with its own terms. He paused again, not for effect, but because the document required precision. The primary beneficiary is, he looked down once more, then back up. You. He didn't say my name with emphasis. He didn't need to. The shift in the room was immediate but quiet, not a reversal in the dramatic sense. No one gasped, no one stood up, but something foundational had moved. My stepmother's expression didn't collapse. It adjusted. Quickly, efficiently, like she was recalculating in real time. That doesn't align with the will, she said. It doesn't have to, the lawyer replied, still calm. This trust operates outside of it, legally distinct, and, from what I can see, quite deliberate. There was no edge in his voice, just clarity, which made it harder to argue with. He began outlining the details, assets placed into the trust, conditions, timelines. It wasn't excessive. It wasn't even larger than what had been distributed elsewhere. But it was intentional, carefully separated, protected from interference. I listened without interrupting, not because I didn't care, but because, in that moment, speaking would have felt unnecessary. Across the table, my stepmother tried once more to regain footing. There must be some oversight, she said. Some inconsistency between these documents. The lawyer shook his head slightly. If anything, he said, this suggests your husband anticipated that possibility. The sentence landed without force, but it stayed. For the first time, she didn't respond immediately. The room settled into a different kind of silence now. Not the earlier one shaped by assumption, but something more measured. I realized, sitting there, that this wasn't about winning. There was no satisfaction rising in me, no urge to meet her gaze to confirm what had just shifted. Because the shift hadn't come from me, it had come from structure. From time, from something my father had put in place quietly, without discussion. And maybe that was the part that stayed with me the most. Not that he had chosen differently in the end, but that he had done it without changing anything outwardly. The lawyer finished his explanation, gathered the papers, and asked if there were any questions. No one spoke. My stepmother leaned back slowly, her hands resting in her lap now, no longer guiding the room. I stood not abruptly, just when it felt appropriate. There was nothing to add. No reconciliation waiting, no understanding suddenly unlocked, just a clearer picture of what had always been there underneath the surface. As I moved toward the door, I felt her glance follow me, not heavy, not confrontational, just present. I didn't turn around. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter exactly, just more defined. For years, I had adjusted myself to fit into spaces where decisions were made without me. Now, for the first time, something had been decided without needing my presence at all, and it had still included me, not loudly, not generously, but deliberately, and that I realized was enough.